good afternoon and good morning and other time appropriate salutations to everyone. I know I can see people joining in different parts of the world. Welcome to this international webinar being jointly organized by UNCTAD, by GIZ, AIRC, and Vila. And we have a pleasure of hosting some of the eminent voices in this field. Let me take a minute or two to set the context and also introduce the panel here. The fundamental purpose why we have organized this is to achieve two things. First being, we want to bring in some clarity in terms of what is ODR, because the more you read, the more literature you review, different forms of ODR are presented. So therefore, we would like our panelists to throw some light on what is ODR, and we'll spend initial couple of minutes on that. Then we'll switch to the main purpose of this webinar, that is to review the policy. Different countries, I will start with international efforts. UNCTAD started it in 2016, and subsequently UNCTAD has done a great deal of work, particularly with focus on e-commerce and consumer grievance redressal. And in that context, I have great pleasure welcoming Arnau, who is a senior official from UNCTAD, and he has been involved in these studies involving e-commerce and ODR. So therefore, and then we have at the regional level, we have Sita Zimpal of GIZ. GIZ has been supporting ODR initiatives in ASEAN region. And she has seen that how adoption of ODR, development of conducive policy framework, and how the design principles of ODR can be responded to by different national governments, how different countries, different economies find value in ODR, and how they tend to adopt it or selectively adopt it. So there's a good experience which will be brought to all of us by Sita. At a national level, we have Suhaan Mukerji, who has been involved in a variety of policy making situations, largely economic policy, but also otherwise. And Suhaan's specialty is that he can deal with policy, statutory, and regulatory issues all seamlessly. And I've had good fortune of assisting him here and there on some small things, but I know for sure that his ability to spot opportunities for a new phenomena like ODR in existing legislations, in new legislations, in where you don't have a statutory backing, even those scenarios. So we will hear from him how ODR can be a useful tool. He serves as a managing partner of PLR Law Chambers. And we have Muhammad Faiz Aziz from Indonesia. Aziz is a head of law studies department in an Indonesian university, the name of which I won't be able to pronounce, I'm sorry. But I know you are an ODR scholar, you're pursuing your PhD in ODR field. And so there is business to consumer and business to business. ODR has tremendous use cases, and we are going to discuss all of these here. But the next thing I want to mention is that we will structure our next 60 minutes as follows. We will try to have understanding of what is ODR, and then we'll get to review of the policies. And then in between, if you have questions, please feel free to either speak up or type it out in the chat box, and we will take those questions suitably. To begin the conversation, in the first segment of our conversation, let me invite Arnau and mention briefly what has been UNCTAD's experience in this area, how you started, and what have you learned, where does it work, where it works suboptimally. Give us some sense of your experience, Arnau.
Thank you very much for the invitation to CUTS International, to this important event. My name is Arnau Izaguerri, and I'm a legal officer at the Competition and Consumer Policies branch. For those of you who do not know UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development is the focal point within the United Nations family on trade, development, and interrelated issues, which includes consumer protection. As focal point for consumer protection, we believe that consumers need to participate fully from the digital economy. And in order to overcome the digital divide within and among countries, it is necessary to empower consumers. We also believe that there is no explanation or no moral justification why some consumers may access dispute resolution for their consumer disputes and some others don't. So we believe that online dispute resolution is a key fundamental part of a healthy market, both nationally, regionally, and internationally. We at UNCTAD have had the experience of a technical cooperation project entitled Delivering Online Dispute Resolution for Consumers. And this has targeted Thailand and Indonesia as a pilot project to see how best to assist governments in enhancing online dispute resolution nationally. This project has been implemented since 2020 until 2023, and there are already some lessons learned. First of all, is that there is a huge gap in the development perspective of dispute resolution and the digital economy. You should know that even though consumption represents 60% of GDP, business to consumer e-commerce represents only 20% of the digital economy. And of that, only 10% is cross-border. So there is an unmatched potential of how consumers could benefit from the digital economy, especially cross-border e-commerce. And we believe that a source of that unused potential is the lack of effective cross-border online dispute resolution. For this, there are various issues to take into account. And although the idea of having a global online dispute resolution is very simple, it is very difficult to put that into work. And I think CETA has a lot of valuable experience at regional level that you will want also to listen to. Our experience indeed has been on benchmarking best international practices. And so far, only the European Union and ASEAN have serious plans to have an online dispute resolution at regional level. It is also true that there is a big divide between publicly led and privately led online dispute resolution. Today, online platforms that dominate world trade, 90% of which are from the United States and China by market capitalization, they compete with an added advantage of providing online dispute resolution for consumers. Basically, those businesses who operate in big online platforms can access the service of online dispute resolution, including cross-border. Those businesses who don't participate in those platforms cannot compete in that on consumer trust. These platforms have resolved the big issues of jurisdiction, of conflict of laws, of enforcement of ODR decisions and sustainability, which are still big questions that remain unsolved for publicly led online dispute resolution. So far, the most advanced countries on online dispute resolution for consumers are in Latin America. Brazil can resolve up to 90% of online dispute resolution cases by consumers using its online dispute resolution platform called consumidor.gov.br. But Mexico and Colombia both have strong online dispute resolution that are publicly led. Why do we think this is important? Well, although it is, of course, natural that governments enhance private business to develop online dispute resolution, it is also important to ensure that these systems upheld consumer rights. And a way to ensure that all consumers' rights are upheld and not only those that participate in a particular business or platform, is to have a fallback option of online dispute resolution that is publicly led. Navneet, I could speak for ages and hours, but let me know if there's any particular issue. Otherwise, it's over to you.
No, I think this sets the context. Thank you very much for giving us UNCTAD's experience with Thailand, with ASEAN, Europe, and also bringing in the Latin American perspective. I think it's very helpful, very encouraging to know that Brazil ODR is delivering so massively. So encouraging to know that. Let me get a little more granular, and before I invite Sita, let me also introduce two of my distinguished co-hosts, Kritika Sethi and Mrinalini Srivastava, who will be intervening in between. Kritika is a co-founder of ODR platform called Vivad, and Mrinalini is coordinating our ODR learning platform, learning initiative at TIRC. That's a quick introduction. Let me bring in Sita here, who has very nuanced regional level understanding of how ODR has been responded to, at least initially. She has been involved in these issues for last 3 to 5 years and has published a couple of very important reports from ASEAN perspective. Let's hear from Sita. And if you wish to have a presentation, please feel free to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Navneet. I'm trying to grapple with the technology as usual, so give me a second to share my screen, and please do let me know once it appears.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you very much again to CRC and CUTS for inviting GIZ. My colleagues are in the call as well from Indonesia to participate and share some reflections on ODR for consumers in Indonesia and ASEAN during today's webinar. As Arnau has mentioned, let me see if I can go to the next slide, 1 second. As Arnau has mentioned, let's start with framing and putting a lens to what we are actually discussing from our perspective in ASEAN this afternoon. So what do we talk about when we talk about ODR in ASEAN? We're zooming in on consumer dispute resolution and B2C schemes. So we are really, of course, aware that ODR is a vast field to plow, so many different areas, aspects, and approaches that we could examine in further detail. But let's confine ourselves here with the B2C schemes that are being initiated in ASEAN, also as an extension of online complaints handling. When I discussed this webinar in the preparation with Navneet, I heard that there is a mass movement of ODR in India, which is exciting to hear about. And of course, it would be interesting to contrast the experience from an emerging economy like India with the countries that we have here in the region. And in principle, to echo what Arnau has said as well, there is in principle fertile ground for ODR to take root in this part of the world as well. There's growing internet penetration and also a growing consumer affinity to adopt new technologies, not least based or after the COVID-19 pandemic experience. And so in general, we do see a very dynamic region when it comes to digitalization. And that, of course, also would pave the ground, we hope, for further or wider parallel efforts and developments when it comes to the digital delivery of justice, not just on consumer protection, but also within the courts, so the e-courts, and also in the private sector, mentioning here legal tech initiatives. All of this, of course, is aligned with a long-standing and a long-term vision of the ASEAN consumer protection authorities in the 10 member states to build up or to set up an ASEAN ODR network with the timeline, at least on a pilot basis, by 2025. However, since there is no real international gold standard to accommodate, and there are so many different or diverse country contexts in this part of the world, there was very much a need to actually explain or exemplify what do we mean by the ASEAN ODR network and what actually are criteria or milestones for national ODR systems in ASEAN that would later link up with this ASEAN ODR network. I don't know if you can see it now. So what do we know so far? I think it is important to note that when it comes to ASEAN, we're talking about a different level of consumer empowerment that has been attested to be at the very best moderate across the region. And this means there is a clear importance for public enforcement in consumer protection. And the rationale is therefore for ODR not necessarily to alleviate the case burden in the courts, but the potential of lowering the bar, if you will, in access to redress for consumers. In our work on consumer protection across ASEAN, where we see the most critical gaps and challenges to be persisting is really with respect to consumer dispute resolution and redress. And we also have to be aware that when it comes to the role of consumer protection authorities, for the most part, these are divisions or departments in the trade ministries in the member states where they need to compete with overarching economic priorities and therefore have limited human resources to take care of the nitty-gritty small claims or complaints that arise on the consumer side. And so ODR, again, has the potential and promise presenting through gradual digitalization and automation of routine processes, for example, to screen and refer consumer complaints and claims to alleviate this strain on limited resources on the human side. And again, given vast geographical expanses like we are presented with in Indonesia, ODR also, of course, allows for remote synchronous and asynchronous communication and online mediation that would expedite resolution. And so the ASEAN ODR guidelines that Navneet, you mentioned from last year, they were introduced as a soft law instrument to provide broad orientation for consumer protection authorities in the member states on what are key principles to go for and what to consider in setting up domestic or national level ODR systems. But at the same time, because ASEAN is for sure not the EU, these systems would need to be designed attuned to the country-specific conditions and circumstances we find, so further in-depth assessment and approaches that are context-specific would be required. You can read up on all this on ASEANconsumer.org, which is the main portal of the ASEAN Committee on Consumer Protection. But let me recap very quickly once again what are the main characteristics or tenets of ODR as foreseen in ASEAN. So we're looking at an extension of ADR or alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that are essentially government-led. We're looking at a strong and active role and involvement of the consumer protection authorities, the main authorities in charge, more flexible, voluntary, and in the spirit of ASEAN, also consensus-based settlement procedures, primarily through mediation. And what is also important to highlight that these would not replace or preclude existing offline mechanisms that would have to be strengthened as well. The most important part here, given that there would inevitably be different paces or dynamics in setting up ODR systems in different settings, in different sectors, in different countries, there would need to be a need to design with interoperability in mind and openness in mind, so that the integration across sectors and jurisdictions could be foreseen over time. There are further design criteria and questions that we pose in the ASEAN ODR guidelines that would guide consumer protection and other relevant authorities in national consultations on what is entailed and what needs to be prepared for a national ODR system. But let me, perhaps in the interest of time, go to a few questions that came up by way of a reality check from our work, from our initial work on ODR readiness in the Indonesian context. And Mr. Aziz can perhaps add to this a little bit later on. The key message here is that ODR is more than just finding a solution for the IT infrastructure and the user interface. What is often overlooked and where we need to put more attention is on policy advocacy and driving a high-level overarching political commitment and consensus, either with or without law reform. This may differ again in the different countries. And so what is always something where we need to start is who sets the tone from the top, if you will, to also then subsequently streamline or synchronize on the more practical level business processes and procedural matters also across sectors. And here again, this tone from the top is critical because what we have observed in Indonesia, if I may say, is very often a pronounced sectoral ego where then integration or interoperability is pushed to the limit. Another point that is important to scrutinize here is, of course, again, looking at the integration and bringing in local dispute resolution bodies that in countries like Indonesia may be scattered across different provinces and districts. How can we overcome operational funding and capacity gaps that already exist on the ground and that might even be added to when it comes to embracing digital mechanisms or digital tools? And so digital skills development is a key point where we need to also factor in relevant capacity building or outreach measures in order to enhance readiness for ODR to be embraced also on the government entities or on local dispute resolution side. And last but not least, I think another critical point perhaps that we can build on and for that can be food for thought for our further discussion: how do we promote consumer empowerment, effective business participation once an ODR system has been set up with the criteria mentioned beforehand? And how can we also ensure, and perhaps that is something that Arnau might touch on when it comes to integration of blockchain technology, how can maybe this, with or without human intervention, drive also certainty, consistency, and impartiality of outcomes for the disputing parties involved? And with this, I hope I stayed within the time enough need. I hand back to you as moderator, and I look forward to engaging further with you on any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for providing a quick yet comprehensive perspective, Sita. This is helpful because we understand that when you start these conversations at a regional level, what are the kind of challenges, what are the kind of avenues or opportunities ODR can present. And I see a couple of emphatic points from your presentation that there seems to be a preference for this to be a public funded, public initiative, government-led initiative. But I mean, what is quite impressive to note is the emphasis on interoperability, because that's what will bring integration in the systems. And also I saw your emphasis on digital skills, because that's what will lead to wider adoption. Not just, I think ODR is itself is a great use case, but we are seeing the march of digital economy in other areas, and digital literacy, digital skills is a major issue across the sectors of digital economy. Having heard these two international and regional perspectives, let me now get down to a national level and invite Mr. Suhaan Mukerji to give us, because he is interfacing with a fairly complex economy, complex set of legal and economic issues in India. India presents a fantastic sandbox in terms of variety of legal, sectoral, legal, economic, and other social challenges. And amidst all this, Suhaan, how do you see, because as I said initially, ODR means different things to different people. Can you help us reduce the confusion? Because there is a court-led IT process, which is nothing but automation. Then there is court-led ODR, which is injecting ADR into court-annexed mediation and things like those. And then there is ODR marketplace. So different layers are evolving, and we need your help to decode what's happening around.
Thank you, Navneet. And I think the previous speakers have actually set the ground very well. Your colleague actually has my presentation and she could share it. I'll do a quick run through those slides because they touch upon various aspects of it. But I think the points that Sita was making with regard to political commitment, something that is already there in India, which I think is very, very good for this ecosystem. I mean, most people wouldn't be aware that we were looking at ODR as far back as 2006 in India. And with Niti Aayog and others coming in, if you could just go to the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. This is the broad understanding of ODR if you were to look at the Indian market. And there are positives and negatives of it. Obviously, we have looked at digitization from the 2000s as far as the justice system was concerned. And therefore, there is a bias towards looking at this being a facilitation framework with technology. And there is a correlation with ADR as well, because you wanted to unburden the court system, but it was also a framework of an access to justice uh, initiative, which was also mentioned as one of the key reasons for why we should be doing this. I feel if I can summarize it in one line, you need to dismantle the economy around dispute resolution, because there is an economy built around dispute resolution and market intermediation in dispute resolution. And if you don't strike at that, all else will fail. So while you replicate all of this, and this is a term that I like using, which is about the economy around and the disintermediation, which is essential for all of this to survive, because what we are trying to actually create is provide parity between parties as well as agency, uh, and to reduce the friction that occurs, or the ability to modulate the friction either up or down, and that is a function of the economy of dispute resolution and gatekeepers that are there. The next slide, please. And this is the history that we've actually seen of ADR here and ODR in India. And actually, there's another element that would come after this, where just last week, the cabinet of the government of India approved the third phase of the e-courts program, in which ODR has been placed front and center, and a mandate around digitization of all dispute resolution, in a sense. Next slide. The objectives essentially are to, again, like we said, make it cost effective, reduce friction, convenient and quick dispute resolution, and access. So these are the kind of the pillars that we are thinking about. And in that sense, I mean, even though I'm from the legal community, I think what we need to be able to do is to get rid of folks like us from intermediating disputes. I don't see the state being removed as necessarily a good thing, because it's only the state that can provide parity between parties, and bring about that balance. But it requires a lot of education also on the side of, the consumer, in a sense, because let's face it, corporates do have a far greater advantage. I think mechanisms to ensure parity can only come from the state, or to create guarantees. But that doesn't mean state interference. You need framework that recognize this, essentially. And if we look at the previous slide, if you just go to the previous slide, uh, there is a statutory backing that's coming in. And the good thing is that the Securities Exchange Board of India, which is the market regulator in the securities market, like the SEC in the US, is mandating ODR for all market participants. So anyone who's listed, other market participants have to compulsory look at this. So this is where regulator is backing the initiative. The Data Protection Board is looked at ADR and is said online, which is the new data law that was passed a month ago here in India, and is going to come into effect in another month. And I actually feel that the online platform economy is some place where we can actually look at what Sita was alluding to on the cross-border piece, and we could actually create framework, because terms of service are cross-border and people are located in different jurisdictions. And it's a great example, but I think we need states to come together. A few years ago, I had a conversation with, just looking at the countries where consumers sit. So, if you were to look at Indonesia, India, South Africa, Brazil, where the large consumer base on the internet economy sits, it can be a framework where dispute resolution is driven by the consuming state. So what I mean, I don't like to use the term South, as such, but where the consumer base of the internet economy lies in terms of numbers, and you can drive this area to be a place where I think ODR can be very, very successful. The mediation bill, which is there and is soon to be passed, also includes this as part of a pre-litigation mechanism. Next slide. And obviously, we need to measure success as examples. The previous slide, please. Yeah. This is how at even state level, in the federal system in India, we've seen large number of disputes being resolved. If you look at the Lok Adalat, which is people's forums, this is about $100 million worth of disputes which have been settled. So we are seeing this movement take place. I don't know whether anyone's measured the fairness piece, because I think it's important to be able to access has to be a measure of ensuring that there is parity and that there is agency. So what's the consumer of an ODR system feeling once they've actually dealt with it, and on both sides, on both parties. I think that's an area which we need to focus on to get a qualitative understanding of what's working and what's not. Next slide, please. Now, there's the further emphasis in our digital ecosystem as well, and in our digital economy. The ONDC network is pretty much like the payments UPI framework that we had, a platform-led, stack-led framework for the e-commerce industry in India. And it's being built as public infrastructure. So sellers, buyers, everybody can just get onto this unified platform. And this is mandated ODR and built it into its dispute resolution mechanism right from the ground up. So it'll be, as this ecosystem grows, ODR is in its DNA. And that will be interesting to look at that. And again, similarly, in the UPI payments ecosystem, which is our best global example for public information infrastructure, I think ODR coming in is great. And it was opportune because I was there when all of this was being initially considered, when I was in the office of advisor to the Prime Minister looking at public information infrastructure. And I'm actually happy to see that the way that this is picked up, and when you build it into the DNA, then nobody finds it strange. It's par for the course to be able to utilize this functionality. And I look at it as a functionality on public infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, where there is a transactional based framework. And I think the more that you can build it into a framework that people get used to, people will start utilizing it. Next. Again, yeah, I mean, this is again how it's being used in India, what I touched upon. ONDC, the large public infrastructure platform for e-commerce. Next, private sector has taken this up very, very strongly in India. The largest banks have been adopting this. You're seeing a lot of this in the insurance sector. You're seeing a big uptake in smaller disputes in the automobile sector and in the infrastructure sector, in construction, etc. E-commerce platforms, and that is actually a space which I believe created great efficiency. I actually sit on the panels for a couple of these online dispute resolution platforms that look at the formal arbitration process, and it's a faceless procedure. We just look at documentation, and it's been an interesting experience looking at this. Efficiencies are great, and we've seen that there's great acceptability because the platforms ensure that there's a fairness, and the principle that is underscored is that there's a fairness which is there. And this is an institutional approach to ODR, but been very successful within the framework of the Arbitration Act. And we've measured that there's not many disputes arising out of it. And that's an interesting piece that I've personally had the chance to participate in. Next slide, please. Of course, when you're looking at contract performance, I think it's a very, very essential way to measure efficiency and reduce friction. Dispute resolution, if it can be done less than 100 days, there are studies that show it adds 2% to your GDP, which is a very, very interesting piece to unlock economic benefits and capital that gets just locked up, and that I think is a very, very interesting incentive for people to do this. Next slide. AI is an interesting thing. I think this still should be inside a sandbox framework to look at which disputes can go and be dealt with this without human intervention. I think this is something where even if you have it, parties should be able to call in an oversight mechanism, because I still believe you need to have responsibility. You can't say that it is an AI system that decided it. Uh, it requires somebody to be able to take be held accountable, which is not just an avatar or a digital, engine. And therefore, we need to be able to, again, qualitatively measure whenever we are deploying AI into a system such as this. And there has to be an oversight board that looks at all AI decisions if any of the parties were to bring it forward. But it's an exciting space to be in. And I think a lot of training can go into engines where I feel data from ODR that has already taken place, which has been successful, can be fed into train engines. But of course, controlling for biases and we checking for biases as well. Next slide. Hello. Yeah, I mean, these are just looking at it in terms of courts, etc. I mean, next slide. Just again, a performance evaluation tool where you can run analytics, data also the same. Next slide. Yeah, so my conclusions are, I mean, great momentum seems to be going in the right direction. It's become kind of like a people's movement. Great kudos to the government in trying to make this a people's movement. I think the public trust which is there in things that the government does has and programmatically in government programs to get people excited about things. This government's does that well, and ODR has been one of the things that's been picked up. And I think as the digital ecosystem grows, this is going to be one of the pillars and will eventually, I think, become a separate public information infrastructure that will be deployed, which is cross-cutting, which will function horizontally across different sectors. And I think it's an exciting time for that. And I think that cross-cutting horizontal design of this as public infrastructure can become and work across jurisdictions, especially because digital infrastructure and digital consumption and transaction is actually working in horizontal markets in a sense across legal markets. Let's say for a better term. And I think you've got great people on this panel who can actually make that happen. And I think we should take this subset of people that you've been able to put together to actually work on this and to figure out models and examples, because there's nothing better than creating great models and examples to be able to scale this. Thank you.
Thank you. So, and that's truly helpful because you were able to survey an extremely large set of issues at almost every level: court, NGOs, private companies, private ODR platforms, and everything, practically everything. And 3 points distinctly stand out. Number one, how ODR can really make markets more efficient by building trust, by reducing time and money involved in dispute resolution. So in a sense, you're making markets more believable, more working, more trustworthy. That's truly good, truly helpful. The second one was the AI point being put in a sandbox and see how that can really move the wheels faster. And still, you have a supervision, you have an accountability. That's an important point. And thirdly, thanks for connecting the disputes DPI to cross-border dispute resolution, which are now mentioned at the outset. So I think this, thanks for presenting the design elements of the disputes DPI, which India, since it has some lead in other sectors, we have every reason to believe that even a disputes DPI should see light of the day very, very soon in next couple of years.
I actually think this was when we were first, because I've been involved looking at the e-courts program from phase 1, and the fact is it's evolved into a DPI in a sense because of the fact that we have a federal system with high courts in different states with a Supreme Court sitting federally, and you're actually building a digital public infrastructure across different jurisdictions with different stakeholders. And that was the first element of when I proposed looking at the interoperable criminal justice system, is to take a systems approach to the justice system. And it's where the public sector would build it, but I think that lesson is being taken into the private sector, because the transactional stack is being built in the private sector. And that's where I'm saying, if you can build the dispute resolution mechanism into the stack that's being built in payments and in other transactional areas of dispute resolution. I mean, we are working on an interesting piece of where we are working on some tourism legislation, that can we actually build in the grievance stack into the digital management framework for the tourism sector, in a particular state in India, because we want to make it a public infrastructure. And that's the way I think, you can actually create a network effect around it.
So we'll come to these building blocks in a bit. Let me invite Professor Mohammad Aziz to bring in the Asia Pacific experience, particularly business to business dispute resolution, which you have studied there as a scholar. And please tell us what exactly is happening in B2B ODR space in Asia Pacific region.
Okay, thank you, Nafnet, for having me. So I would like to share Indonesian experience and perhaps from the regulatory landslide. And I would like to share my slide first. Okay. Wait. Share screen. Okay. Okay, already seen the slide?
Yes,
all right.
we can see.
Okay, before I discuss about the situation that Indonesia has about the ODR, I would like to provide the figures of our transactions, including in e-commerce and then internet user and mobile connection, as well the cross-border trade and access to redress situation in Indonesia. So in terms of e-commerce, so we have acceleration of digital transformations, especially during and the post coronavirus disease or COVID-19. So as of early 2023, I tried to generate data from the data portal. So our total e-commerce transaction up to 55.97 billions. And the figure was up by more than 2 billion over the same period last year. And in terms of internet user, there are 212.9 million of Indonesian that who use internet, and increase about 10 million from the previous year or 2022. And we have also total export value of trade of US dollar to 175.96 billion in 2022, according to Indonesian Central Statistic Agency. And I interest with previously mentioned by Arnau about 10% of cross-border transaction in terms of business to consumer. And I was difficult to gather the data in terms of cross-border trade, including in B2C as well as the B2B. In terms of institutional and regulatory landscape in Indonesia, we already have a direct reference regulation to ODR. It is a government regulation number 80 2019 on e-commerce. So the regulation mentioned directly about ODR, and there are also at least 17 laws and regulations from the groups of judiciary law, arbitration and alternative dispute resolution law, trade law, and as well as electronic information transaction law and sectoral regulations. So there's no clear arrangement about this kind of regulation, whether it is tried to provide to B2C access to redress system or B2B access to redress system. However, in terms of B2C, Indonesia have already multiple options for B2C dispute resolution in terms of offline. So, as Sita mentioned previously, there are also complaint hotline on our website. there's a Ministry of Trade, and there's also internal mechanism of businesses, including an online platform and local dispute resolution bodies, or BPSK. We call it as BPSK at the provincial level. General and specific ADR bodies, including sectoral, for example, under the Financial Services Authority, and small claim and general court system, as well as Islamic Sharia court. So relevant development happened in Indonesia. So in terms of, the court online resolution, ODR that perhaps tried in the court system. Sorry, apologize me. So we have ecosystem at the Supreme Court and lower courts. It has been introduced to allow for online case management and hearing, and the number of cases, is significantly increased during the COVID-19. If I'm not mistaken, there were only 80,000 cases handled by the lower court in Indonesia, but during the COVID, there was dramatically increased to almost 160 something thousand of cases in Indonesia. And in addition, BANI, or the Indonesian National Arbitration Board, has been conducting hearing also in both synchronous and asynchronous way of feature. During the pandemic, then they handle up to 79 dispute during 2020 to 2021. And in 2022, BANI issued special mechanism of procedure for electronic arbitrations. And key lesson from this, although Indonesia doesn't have specific framework in detail about ODR, however, the arbitration and ADR agency are able to provide electronic dispute resolutions. So the framework is not the inadequacy of framework is not an obstacle, but the autonomy and self-governance of ADR bodies, as well as debating parties, become major supporting for the format to materialize ODR. Nevertheless, this term is still less popular. Sorry, less popular in our country, and what Nafnet mentioned previously, whether it is a government initiative or whether it is a people initiative, I would say that this is still a government initiative. So less people know about the ODR, less businesses know about ODR in Indonesia, especially micro, small, and medium enterprises, and less consumer also know about ODR. So about the APEC collaborative framework for ODR, so our agency, our institution, where I work right now, in the early of 2023, we have conduct research supporting by the APEC economists, and we try to compare regulatory landscape in economies that have declared opt-in into the framework of ODR in APEC. So in general, there are no specific ODR legal framework exists even in the United States, Singapore, China, Hong Kong, China, as well as Japan. There are 5 economies that have been declared to opt in and to use the APEC ODR framework to settle the dispute among the cross-border B2B transactions. And how about Indonesia? So Indonesia itself, it's interesting to declare opt-in. And last month, I had a meeting with the official from the ministry, and most of the ministry are positive to make Indonesia opt-in into the APEC framework, since the opt-in mechanism is very soft law. Yeah, and without any further modification of law, without revision of law, without ratifying or without exceed, Indonesia can with the characteristic of ADR agency in Indonesia, so Indonesia can declare opt-in, and perhaps one agency can provide and comply to the standard of already provided by the APEC. Nevertheless, we still have a homework to do in our country, including by developing a common understanding about the ODR. So as Nafnet perhaps previously mentioned about the ODR, so at least there are two contrasting scholars or perspective about ODR. The first one is about ODR as a tools to support ADR or electronic ADR. The second perspective is about ODR is not just a tools but also as independent mechanism that can resolve any dispute with or without human interventions. And it is interesting that Suhaan previously mentioned about AI. Since AI, I mean, is still developing. I believe, yeah, in terms of the provide the decisions, and this understanding, a common understanding of ODR will affect what kind of policy, what kind of definition that will Indonesia provide into the public, into the legislation in the near future. And next one about driving and devising necessary regulation and processes, and as well as increasing public awareness. Since less people know about ODR in Indonesia, and also literacy of digital, this is important since Indonesia has more than 17,000 island, and also the remote island, and they have also lack of literacy of digital as well as lack of internet access, especially in outer area. Improvement of all the infrastructure, as I previously mentioned about the literacy also, and as well as capacity building for relevant stakeholders. For the midterm and long-term vision, since Indonesia is part of the ASEAN member nations, so we commit also to integrate into ASEAN ODR network in terms of B2C, and in terms of B2B, perhaps not. I mean, in the near future, the focal point of Indonesia in APEC, especially in coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs, will declare about the opt-in mechanism, opt-in mode into the APEC ODR services. And about the building blocks, surely the component to support the implementation of ODR in the future, including when Indonesia has initiative to revise current regulation about the arbitration and ADR law, is to define roles and mandate, and then to make up the procedures and to gather data and secure the data, develop IT system, and then try to provide anti-forum shopping system, monitoring, and last one is interoperability. Perhaps that's all enough that I would like to share briefly. I will get back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aziz. I would like to invite my co-host or any member of the audience, please raise a question, because we have now received a very good background on what is happening and what policy has been put in place. So because I'm also mindful of the time, that there's not much time, but nevertheless, very happy to have questions slash follow-up on what has been presented so far. Anybody?
I want to ask a question that how ODI institution resolves private law issues. Like Sahita said about national ODI system, how does it ensure cross-border interoperability?
So you mean to say that since the ASEAN region has experimented with a regional level, so how the cross-border interoperability was achieved? Is that the question?
Yes, sir. And how ODI institution resolves the private law issues, like private international law issues? It was mentioned by Arnau, I think.
Any panelists, Sita or Arnau, because or Aziz, if you since you have cross-border.
Okay, thank you, Navnet. Perhaps I would like to respond what Marina Lini asked about the private international law issues. Yeah, yes. Since the cross-border transaction is very related to private international law issues, this is very important. I mean that disputing party or parties contractor parties to provide the choice of forum and choice of of law that would like to address to mitigate the risks when they face the disputes. In terms of ASEAN itself, if I'm not mistaken, some of ASEAN members, including Thailand, Vietnam, Brunei, as well as Singapore, is already part of the member of the CCH. Meanwhile, Indonesia itself is still planning to become the member. Nevertheless, currently Indonesia is preparing the bill provide international law that can perhaps provide any protection to our people, including in facing and potentially facing about the dispute in the future.
Thank you, sir.
Now, you want to reflect on this
if
question?
I may?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Of course, private international law is the remit of national legislation, and there's no convention on consumer protection and private international law. So usually, national law will relate to either some public policy that will set the criteria, which is the point of connection to address the conflict of laws, or it will remit itself to general civil law. Now, we find this problematic because general civil law usually relates or reposes on the will of the parties. And although the contract between a business and a consumer may contain a selection of both jurisdiction and conflict of laws, it is not clear that consumers actually consent to this willingly. Usually consumers click and hope for the best. They don't read what the general contract terms are because they are 30 pages long. So, and just as much as consumer protection can counter some unfair terms and conditions, it may be arguable that a choice of law in general terms may not be opposable to a consumer. The idea behind some choices of public policy for private international law, putting the law of residence of the consumer or the jurisdiction of residence of the consumer, is that the consumer is the weaker party, and the consumer is probably more aware of the expectations that he or she may have in its national context. Some may argue that it is better to have the applicable law of the country where the business has received the acceptance of the contract, which sometimes it is in also a point of connection. So say if Indian, Indonesian, Thai consumer engages with a US business, some may argue that it is better to have the substantive law point of connection of US law because it may be more more protective of consumer rights than their national legislation. I would counter to that is probably irrelevant if the consumer does not know it and cannot really action those rights. And we cannot expect consumers to know what is the best forum shopping or choice of laws when engaging in a consumer operation. So I think here there is room for improvement of clear public policy setting, which is a clear point of connection for all consumer contracts. I think a simple principle would be the country of residence of the consumer and the execution or place of residence of the consumer for both the connection of conflict of laws and jurisdiction. And that would also include the online dispute resolution institution that would be competent to solve the consumer dispute. I hope that was clear. Thank you.
Suhaan has got something to add to that.
Yeah, I do. I think the way to move this forward becomes easier as we see the platformization of the economy and platforms working across jurisdictions, because I think we need to be able to create principles on the regulation of platforms, which will then automatically have a spin-off here. And I think the fundamental principle is, we've seen this in international trade law where you have a most favored nation type of baseline that all countries try and drive to when they're looking at trade. And I think we should have a framework of where we are looking at a most favored consumer baseline principle. So if there are rights in any jurisdiction where the consumer is most favored, that's what becomes a principle that's applied across the platform wherever it operates. And that can resolve a lot because it's basically a block and tackle that a person on one side of the dispute would try to do to accentuate the fissures of the issues around private international law and the differences in jurisdictions and the conflicts that can arise. To get to the root of that, I think regulation of the platform economy and sovereigns coming together, because it's only sovereigns that can actually say that we will agree to this baseline. And I think it can be built into the framework of trade agreements and looking at the digital trade part of it. We've agreed on, say, for example, no customs on small packages coming through. If we can solve stuff like that, which actually which hits the revenues of sovereigns and arrive at agreements around there, I think you can easily make sovereigns agree and then twist the arms of platform owners to actually benefit consumers equally as a baseline. And I think we are seeing the world move towards that. But again, I think this is a great group that could actually work together to drive that agenda, and create examples.
Thank you. I think we will definitely do follow up on this suggestion, Suhaan, but I can see Kritika's hand being raised up. Please bring your question.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much. I firstly thank all the panelists for such an enriching discussion. My question is, after learning from Suhaan that the seeds of ODR in India were sown way back in 2006, and learning from Mohammad Aziz sir about how it has been done in Indonesia, my question is that we are still investing in capacity building. So when do you see that the potential of ODR can be utilized in an optimal manner in our jurisdictions? And that would include ASEAN jurisdictions. I'll be happy if any panel member could answer.
Okay. So I think the optimization, it never stops, because it'll depend on the nature of disputes, and disputes are never going to go away. It's a fundamental facet of us as human beings, in a sense. So the optimization of it is when you can qualitatively measure that and quantitatively measure whether disputes are being resolved in a more timely and efficient manner, and qualitatively, is there a high level of trust and satisfaction? And I think scaling that, the sense of trust in a system is what's going to show that it's working optimally.
Yeah, so if I may say, I think it's very hard to pinpoint an exact time when that would really come to fruition and it would happen, and we would see the real benefit on the ground for both the consumers and businesses involved in disputes that are caused through ODR systems. I think for ASEAN, we definitely see now that it has been overly ambitious to actually already come up with the ASEAN ODR network by 2025, which is just around the corner, because as Aziz has highlighted, there's still so much homework to be done, not just in Indonesia, but also in countries that are far less economically and digitally evolved and developed as Indonesia. Laos, PDR, if they were to become part of this, there's an entirely different setting that we're faced with. And the question that was mentioned earlier on choice of law or applicable law is something that is still not yet resolved, where in ASEAN there has been some discussion here and there, but indeed there has not been a clear direction on how to deal with this matter. And at the same time, as you mentioned, Suhaan, building and maintaining public trust and procedural transparency and all of those issues are critical for that to actually be embraced by the consumers and the businesses at large. And there we still need, I think, to invest much more in public advocacy, policy advocacy, outreach, and capacity building efforts. So I think we will need to still have a longer time frame, personally, to actually see the real use cases that can also inspire a bit more than what we see initially right now. I mean, there's already a good start, but I think still much more that needs to be done, and it's always evolving. And there's a reason also, perhaps last but not least, why then for ASEAN you would still need the human intervention. You would not be able to do it in this part of the world, at least, without the facilitation of the government in these processes that are highly also politically contentious in terms of cross-border aspects and also cross-sectoral issues.
Right. Let me see. I mean, before we close, I want to come back to Suhaan one more time and bring the recently concluded G20 summit in India and the declaration where, we agreed that the DPI, India's DPI stack can be taken forward. From here, the presidency has gone to Brazil and thereafter to South Africa. All of you have significant presence internationally and in these regions. So therefore, the question which I've received directly in my chat box is that how the existing elements of India stack, for example, the identity, for example, the payments. So there are some elements which are already available in India stack, which can contribute to the dispute DPI. And how can those elements be leveraged? That's the question. And subsequently, once Suhaan has responded, I would like Sita, Aziz, and Arnau to reflect how we can shorten the learning curve and really make an international case for ODR. May I request Suhaan first?
Yeah. So I think the elements that can obviously be taken, overseas is the transparency in transactions. So I would say that the principles that are there. So the key is how do you create transparency in a transaction, and you create a mechanism by which you have a way to trace the history to be able to see if the nature of the dispute and liability and fault. And I think that's what where you can do that is obviously on the payment side very clearly. And I think that's a space where disputes on e-commerce as well as payments is somewhere that something can be taken and replicated. And the way that we are integrating ODR into the ONDC, the e-commerce infrastructure, how that could also be ported into systems where there are more mature markets as far as digital commerce is concerned, are what I would say are the starting points. But I think you also have to be cognizant of the fact that trust in different economies and ecosystems from a social context means different things. So just taking identity, I don't think is, I don't think actually that's something that can be taken somewhere else and replicated. Because there are elements of, privacy that, different societies have different measures and standards. So I would say the integration into the e-commerce framework of a digital public infrastructure and starting with payments is where we can actually look at ODR in other jurisdictions.
Right.
And we have UPI that's gone into France, Dubai, Singapore. So yeah, so these are the places that you could perhaps naturally infuse this.
Fantastic. Can we have quick closing reflections from the remaining three panelists? Sita?
Yeah, thank you, Navneet and everyone. I think it's pertinent that we have also international organizations like UNCTAD in this meeting, because there needs to be much more dialogue and exchange on what are the different practical and political obstacles we're facing in making ODR the norm, if you will, or at least a mass movement, people's movement, as you envisage it right now, as you aspire to have in India, and that needs to have a discussion on actually where do we differ in the different countries, what's different in the legal framework, where do, for example, also consumer awareness and consumer empowerment stand, all of these issues. I think there's still not enough discussion on this and learning from each other. And so more, I think, is warranted here, and also perhaps grace to some extent that there might be trial and error in some part, and to what Suhaan, you mentioned, linking up with what's happening in the financial side or the payment side, that is worthwhile looking into as well. But very often we observe in many countries this is a parallel track that is not necessarily associated with the wider consumer protection, access to dispute resolution and redress, but definitely needs more convergence or synchronization moving forward.
Thank you. Professor Aziz, your closing reflection.
Okay, thank you, Navneet. So I have a similar opinion with Sita that has previously mentioned about the awareness. Yeah. Since in Indonesia itself as well, I believe it also happened in other part of the world about the awareness of the ODR, about the discussion and as well as dissemination to the public about ODR, and not only for the people but also for the government. And in the same time, so the government itself should develop more policies as well as the improvement of infrastructure and the improvement of legislation that support the implementation of ODR in the near futures. Without that, without that, I'm a little bit pessimistic that ODR will get the target in the future. Thank you.
Right. Let me come to UNCTAD now, because they have the most power to convene different sectors, different countries, and they already have a very structured research platform around these issues. So how can we really take it forward? Your reflections, Arnau.
Thank you, Navneet. I'd like to highlight one point that Sita raised, and that is political will at international level, which is currently lacking. The Secretary of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution, Mr. Rohit Kumar Singh, in the last intergovernmental group of experts on consumer protection law and policy, which is the highest level meeting happening at the United Nations on an annual basis, and this took place in July 2023, called for an international online dispute resolution for consumers platform. So far, it is the only call we've received, and there is no appetite from other countries. So saying that member states of UNCTAD, which are practically all states in the world, that we have 195, can easily be convinced to sign into ODR infrastructure, say from public international law to technology to capacity building to interoperability, we are far from there. So the awareness that you have to raise among consumers is also awareness that you have to raise among top policymakers. So I encourage you to liaise with your national governments to ensure that they are fully aware of the importance of convening and generating international consensus on this issue, which is pressing for consumers around the world. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us that action pointer. Now we will definitely do what can be done at the national level, but in terms of any research or in terms of moving the dialogue forward, can I also invite you to reflect what can we do before July 24, when you will hold the next ICE meeting? So maybe we have some time and we can build some momentum before that.
Excellent. We are ourselves providing a piece of research on various cases of online dispute resolution for consumers around the world, and we expect to launch it in March of next year. So we hope that that will also inform the discussions at our intergovernmental meeting. We are also releasing soon, perhaps even before the end of the year, a short policy brief on the use of technology for online dispute resolution and for consumer protection agencies, which include chatbots, blockchain, and AI. And we hope that this will also inform discussions. I encourage you to continue research on the various issues that you raised, from the legal, technological, and political dimensions of online dispute resolution, because the better policymakers are informed, the better the decisions that will be taken. Thank you.